Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sam Kleiner, and I'm proud to be moderating this panel today. It's a wonderful day outside, so we appreciate you all taking the time to come in here and learn about the history of America at war. It's wonderful to see a lot of family and friends of a lot of us here. If we could just remind you to turn off your cell phones before we get started, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to begin, before we do introductions and so on, just giving out an overview of what we'll be talking about over the course of the next hour, and we look forward to getting some of your questions. We haven't, as the United States of America has not declared a war since World War II, yet we somehow always have a type of war, whether it's a Cold War, a series of interventions in the 1990s, and now a war on terrorism since 9/11. And as we scale down our war in Iraq, debate the future of the war in Afghanistan, begin to contemplate the increasingly real possibility of a military strike on Iran, it's important that we as citizens take the time to investigate the history of how the United States has and has not gone to war. And we're very pleased to be joined today by a wonderful set of three panelists who are not only scholars of the history of how America has gone to war, but also a set of public intellectuals and policymakers who've been intimately involved with these kind of decisions, who can help shed some light on these important issues today. Introducing to my left here is Andrei Cherny. He's the founder of Democracy, a journal/think tank dedicated to new ideas for America's future. He served as a senior aide in the Clinton administration and was the drafter of the 2000 Democratic Party platform. He's been a fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. After 9/11, he enlisted in the Navy, where he served 8 years as a reserve intelligence officer. He is the author of Candy Bombers, A History of the Berlin Airlift. And in his spare time, Andrei has served as the chair of the Arizona Democratic Party and just announced his candidacy for Congress in the Phoenix area. Next over is Mary Dudziak, who's a professor of law and history at the University of Southern California. She writes extensively on legal history and the impact of war on American democracy. She's a regular contributor to CNN, and her op-eds have appeared in publications such as the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. She's the author of numerous superb books, including Exporting American Dreams, Thurgood Marshall's African Journey, Cold War Civil Rights, and she just published Wartime, An Idea, Its History and Consequences, an exploration of the history of how the sense of America being at war has changed over time. On the far left is William Inboden, who's a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, the LBJ School of Public Policy, and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. Prior to this, he served as a senior director for strategic planning on the National Security Council in the Bush administration, where he was involved in the plan for the surge in Iraq. He's the author of Religion and American Foreign Policy, The Soul of Containment, which explores how the religious convictions of policymakers, particularly Harry Truman, shaped U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War. He's also a Tucson native and a proud graduate of MPhil Public High School. Little hometown shout out. So as we get started, I'd like to begin, Mary, if you will. In a superb op-ed you laid out in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, you tell us how our conception of wartime is different than what we actually think it is. We think that sometimes we're at war and sometimes we're at peace, and war is somehow an aberration from the normal state of how America operates in the world. But your argument provocatively lays out a different vision for that, and I was wondering if you could explain it to us.
Sure, and let me actually start by thanking you all for coming. I have to say it's inspiring on such a beautiful day to see so many people coming inside to talk about ideas, and I'm just grateful that you're here. In the way you sort of described it, we tend to think that war is something that's an aberration, that our normal time is what we call peacetime. And so wartime is something that comes and goes in American history. It's a rupture of the usual state of affairs, which always goes away because normal time, after all, is peacetime. What does that way of thinking do for us? Wartime in this way of thinking is by definition temporary, right? Because wartime is followed by peacetime, and history consists of moving from wartime to peacetime to wartime, etc. And so when we are in the middle of sort of thinking about entering a military conflict, when we think about entering a wartime, we think of ourselves as entering a time that is, by definition, temporary. The thing that's interesting, though, is if you compare the limited number of wars that might have been in your history books when you were in high school. You know, in the 20th century, World War I, there's a World War II chapter. There's something called the Cold War, although it's hard to define exactly what it is. And then there's Vietnam. And then you look at, you know, what I use in the book is, I look at what are the conflicts for which soldiers have earned medals. Medals for having served in a military conflict. And I just plot them on a timeline, and what you see is there's not any breaks there, right? We always have soldiers overseas doing something in harm's way. And so wartime, from that perspective, looks like something that goes on, that doesn't have clear endpoints. And we don't have these moments that really look like, if peacetime means we're not deploying soldiers overseas with weapons, doing things with them, you know, if that's what peacetime is, we simply don't have a lot of it. I think this helps us to see, you know, the sort of legacy underlying where we find ourselves today, where we are in this era where it seems to be so hard to bring war to a close, right? I mean, President Bush had his mission accomplished moment for which he was so criticized, but President Obama had one too. In August 2010, something that everyone forgets, he claimed that that combat operations in Iraq had ended. NBC News signed on and was all excited about the end, and of course, 50,000 soldiers had stayed, and that conflict was ongoing. And so that's sort of an example of the way that our uses of force overseas aren't contained within discrete war times, that we have, that we have a lot more war in American history than we usually imagine. And I think we need to take account of the ongoing character of American military deployment, large and small, and not assume that when we're entering a, quote, wartime, we're entering something that definitely is at some point in the near future going to come to an end.
Thank you. Andrei and William, both of your books deal with the origins of the Cold War. And Andrei, in your book, you let us begin with this beautiful moment at the end of World War II where Germany is defeated, Soviet and American troops come together to celebrate on the Elbe River. And from there, how do we get to this notion of a Cold War shortly thereafter where the Soviet Union becomes an enemy? And William, in your book, you lay out the importance of the ideas that policymakers had, particularly Truman's own religious convictions and what role that played in taking us immediately from the sense of being at war, and why did we decide that another war, albeit a cold one, was something we had to do, and was that inevitable? So I wonder if we could start with William.
Okay, sure. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sam, and great to be back in Tucson again. Thanks for everyone for coming out today. On the first question, in some ways, Andrei and I tackle a similar question from different angles, which is the puzzle, why did the U.S. fight the Cold War? Looking back now, it may seem almost inevitable to us. Well, of course, we had to. The Soviets were a communist superpower, and they were threatening freedom in the world, and that's what America does. But if we can use our historical imaginations to stretch ourselves back to 1945, and I'm sure Andrei will share some on this as well, it didn't at all seem inevitable that the U.S. would fight a Cold War, for a number of reasons. One, we had just finished the bloodiest war that human history had ever known, World War II, catastrophically costly for the United States and especially for the other nations involved. No one on earth wanted any type of new global conflict like that. And second, one of our main and most important allies in World War II was the Soviet Union. So if we go from the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in September of 1945 to just really 6 to 9 months later in early mid-1946, it's a real puzzle. Why does the U.S. all of a sudden by 1946 find itself in the beginnings of this global totalizing conflict against the Soviet Union that again would be very costly in terms of the hot wars as well as our budget and all manner of other things? Well, there's a number of reasons why, and I don't believe in monocausal over determination. Certainly, part of it was the Soviets were perceived as a security threat. Part of it was capitalist ideology against the economic ideology of communism. Part of it was the political ideology of democracy against the authoritarian, totalitarian ideology that you saw in Soviet communism. But part of it, as I argue in my book, was actually religion. Truman and then later American leaders as well felt a sense of divine calling. They thought that God had given the United States its power, its prominence in the world for a certain reason.